Good morning and welcome to Fleetworld's Agile Mobility webinar. I'm Simon Harris, editor of Fleetworld, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Over the next 40 minutes, we're going to focus on two things that are keeping fleet decision makers awake at night right now: operational resilience and total cost of ownership. How do you keep your fleet moving efficiently in a market that won't stay still? And how do you control your costs while it shifts around you? I'm joined by three people who work with fleet operators on exactly these challenges every day. Amber Shanahan from Quartix, who will be talking about how telematics data can sharpen fleet decisions. Stuart Russell from Europcar on how flexible rental can give fleets the room to adapt without long-term exposure. And Naomi Nye from Drax on how a smarter energy strategy can reduce the cost per mile across an electric fleet. And let's start with Amber.
I've worked for Quartix for over 10 years and I'm currently the field account manager for Quartix. So I support our larger customers in terms of any issues that they've got with their account, making sure they make the most out of the data that they have and guiding them with any sort of questions that they have about how they best manage that moving forward with their business.
Stuart, can you tell us a little bit about your role at Europcar?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Simon. So Stuart Russell, Business Development Director for Europcar, been in the rental industry for 38 years, actually, 25 years of which with Europcar. My role is predominantly the conversion of large corporate fleets into flexi rental and spot hire across FEV, BEV and ICE vehicles, and of course, vans and cars. So yeah, looking forward to the session today.
Thanks very much, Stuart. And now, finally, Naomi Nye from Drax. Tell us about yourself and your role at Drax.
Lovely, thank you so much. So as you said, I'm Naomi Nye. My role at Drax is head of sales, so I lead the sales team. And we are really talking to customers on a daily basis about their needs, requirements, how we can help support them and make sure that they've got the right solutions on site to really support their whole electrification process. So for those who probably don't know Drax, we are an energy company. And on the retail commercial side of the business, we support through that whole decarbonisation piece. So that is everything from renewable power and supplying renewable energy, electrification services, so the end-to-end turnkey EV charging solution. We are a charge point operator and we also look at service and maintenance. And we can also look at optimization services. So from there, really making the most of the energy that's on site and getting the most value of it.
Thanks very much, Naomi. So we'll kick off the discussion, and I'll put our first question to Amber. How does telematics help a fleet decision maker prove which vehicles are actually earning their keep and which ones are just taking up space?
So I think the key thing for a fleet manager is to really understand what the vehicles are doing on a daily basis. So where they're going, what they're doing, and ultimately, maybe more importantly, what they're not doing. We all know businesses where there may be depots or different locations where they're adamant that they need that spare vehicle to cover off things like absences, sicknesses, when in reality, it may be that that vehicle sits there and does very little mileage. We actually have got fleet managers who use the Quartix system that have been asked to provide additional vehicles for the fleet, and they've been able to use the data to see that there have been vehicles stood down in their yard for a number of months that can be utilised instead of committing to another long-term asset for the highlighting sort of underutilised vehicles. The system will also help you to understand where you've got overutilised assets. So again, if you are tied into a lease where you've got agreed mileages on vehicles, it's important that you can use the telematics data, which is unbiased, to show you where you might be approaching going over those agreed mileages and again, incurring additional costs to you as a business. In terms of overutilised vehicles, there are other problems that go alongside that. So aside from the increased mileage, it's obviously increased wear and tear, which again is additional costs to a fleet manager and the business itself. Where there's overutilization, it normally means that, again, there will be an overwork of the asset or the person within that vehicle, and that leads to high pressured environments. So where there's high pressured environments, it can lead to things like increased poor driver performance, which again puts drivers at risk when they're on the road, as well as other road users, and will increase in terms of fuel consumption. And again, with the fuel market as it is currently, this is why we're having the discussion today, because more people are thinking about how they can make cost savings by transitioning to an EV fleet. So looking at the current structure, there are some features that Quartix provide through the telematics data which can help to reduce current fuel consumption, such as route mapping and using telematics data to ensure that the routes are optimized, so you're getting the most out of your workforce with as little unnecessary travel time as possible. Going back to the point that I mentioned at the start about people being adamant that they need that additional vehicle on the fleet to cover off those instances where they may need to cover for sickness, absence, vehicle downtime, things like that. Lots of customers now will look at getting a short-term hire before committing to those longer-term assets. So at Quartix, we can provide people with portable telematics devices so that they can ensure that their whole fleet has visibility across the platform, to allow them to use that telematics data to help inform their decision before making any sort of long-term decisions about the long-term fleet solution.
Thank you, Amber. When the data identifies a gap, we need to fill it without the headache of a long-term commitment. So, Stuart, how does flexible rental give a fleet decision maker the breathing space to scale their fleet without getting stuck in a 3-year lease?
Yeah, thank you, Simon. I mean, in today's world, uncertainty is the default factor, right? So, more traditional 3 to 5 year lease was really built for a world of certainty and, stable headcounts, predictable mileages, known business cases. Well, at present, that just isn't the case. In fact, each day brings new challenges for a fleet manager. As I mentioned, uncertainty really is the default position with sort of economic volatility, inflationary pressures that we continue to see. Each day seems to be different. Everybody seems to be hanging on what Trump says and doesn't say, actually, and the markets move accordingly, which really makes a fixed fleet really difficult to manage. Flexible rental changes that, in as much as you can flex your fleet as and when your business moves with those needs. Really, Europcar's flexible offering of 1 month plus allows fleets to upcycle and downcycle according to the trends and needs of their business. What you'll find nowadays is, you have short-term projects or seasonal demands, and we see more and more of that as the economy changes and people's buying habits change as well, and business aligned to that. So flexible fleet really does allow businesses to complement a proportion of their fixed fleet. I'm a firm believer that 80-20 rule in most cases works, where maybe 80% of the fleet is on a fixed 3-year or 5-year lease and 20% is made up with flexible rental, allowing you to adjust that. It also means that fleet managers aren't sat on fixed assets in their car park not being used and covering the cost of that. They can adjust their fleets accordingly. So, yeah, I mean, and no more so than present. I'm sure I saw at the pump yesterday that diesel price was at 195 roughly and increasing rapidly. And what we see in the noise, the mood music at the moment is let's give EVs a go. Let's give BEVs a go, actually. And we're seeing more and more interest in BEVs. And we're allowing customers to trial that BEV before they actually go out and commit and make sure they're fit for use and they can make them work within their business. So we're seeing more and more uptake in that BEV arena, both in cars and vans at the moment.
Thanks, Stuart. If we're trying to keep a lid on lease and acquisition costs, we have to find further operational savings, and we could probably do that in our fuel and power strategy. So, Naomi, how does a smarter approach to energy help lower the overall cost per mile across an electric fleet?
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question, because equally, I think where we're seeing fuel rises, energy is now, electric is now a new fuel, right? And at a time when we're all trying to keep those costs down, and we're electrifying a number of things, not just vehicles. So costs across sites are rising incrementally because of that. So I think it's really thinking about optimizing and thinking about how, when and where the energy is being used. So from a fleet perspective, from a vehicle perspective, you can do that from a very practical and a very basic level when you're thinking about potentially charging schedules. So can you shift to off-peak times where possible rather than charging at peak times? So I think when we're thinking about utilities, where they're putting additional costs on peak power usage, particularly if you've got multiple vehicles that are charging at those peak times, you might find that costs can really spike. So can you think about staggering those times to keep that demand low? Can you use maybe load balancing technology to control the amount of power that's going out? Can you think about on-site energy integration? So can you think about solar or battery storage systems and kind of really bringing those together to make the most of that? Or even thinking about a longer term V2G technology, so vehicle to grid technology. There's lots of really cool technology out there at the moment that can really help you manage and balance that. And I think we're almost having two conversations in the fleet space at the moment, where we've got those fleets that are just starting out and really trying to understand what do they need, how are they going to do it, and when can they do it, to those that are probably a bit more established and thinking about that next step or that next cycle of EV charging that could potentially look at these different types of technologies. So I think it depends where you are in your EV strategy as well. And I think thinking about EV strategy, it's really important when we talk to customers. This is often led by the fleet team because they're the ones that are getting the vehicles, or it's led by procurement because you're having to buy services into the business and they tend to be thinking of that bottom line. But the strategies that have been really, really successful are those that have really brought all of the stakeholders in and involved all of them. So thinking about not just your fleet manager that's involved in the vehicles, but also, you know, your on-site facilities, your energy team, and kind of bringing those in, your sustainability team, and thinking about bringing it together so that your EV strategy is a really clear and defined strategy from day one. And again, there are lots of experts out there like us that, you know, can help support on that. Amber mentioned there about that real-time monitoring and thinking about the vehicles, you know, making sure that you're getting the best out of the battery means that you're also lowering the amount of times that you're needing to charge and actually using that power. So that's really important. And then thinking about, particularly, I think, as we're moving into the bigger vehicles, particularly EHGVs, there's some really nice incentives and different ways of working out there. Well, we can even look at depot sharing, so you don't have to do it all yourself. There are different ways of kind of incorporating, and depot sharing, I think, has been really key, particularly in the EHGV space, where you've had bus markets open up their facilities, use it almost as like an additional revenue stream. So there's lots of different ways that you can play with it. And I think thinking about it doesn't have to be that single solution that fits everyone. What does your site need? What does your business requirements need? And how is your strategy going to adapt as those business requirements change? But thinking about it from a more holistic point of view, I think, is key.
I just want to put another question to Amber. How can mileage data help a fleet decision maker pick the right electric vehicle for the right job, rather than just guessing based on what range they've seen in the brochure?
Yeah, so great question. Obviously, the first step is right sizing your fleet. So that's taking the mileage data that we offer to understand not only the vehicle types that you're looking for and the range that you would need to allow that vehicle to do its job efficiently. It's also making sure that you're only acquiring the EVs that you need to optimally run that fleet. So not procuring too many vehicles, and obviously that will help ultimately with the transition costs from an ICE to an EV fleet. So we're actually about to enter a partnership with an organisation that will take Quartix data. So that's the mileage data, things like Naomi mentioned, so the actual shift pattern of the vehicles, and where those vehicles are parked up overnight in their overnight locations, and they will help customers look at that transition then from an ICE fleet to an EV fleet. As part of that partnership, we would also be looking to offer a map of the current charging network and superimpose that on top of our sort of live tracking map. So at any point in time, customers can see where their vehicles are in terms of the real-time location from any sort of charge point across the UK to help them with that network and understand how they're going to be able to utilise that. So the beauty of obviously having the telematics data is it gives the fleet manager the full visibility of the location of the vehicle both day and night. So as Naomi mentioned, you can start to think about how you implement that strategy in terms of where you're going to charge and how you're going to charge. By looking at the shift patterns, it'll help you to identify where you've got downtime in the vehicle to see when you can sort of naturally charge when the vehicles are not being utilised to kind of manage any sort of disruption to the working day and make sure that, again, you're getting the maximum you can out of the assets that you've got on your fleet and you're making the most of the workload that you've got available. The mileage and trip data are all sort of visible from a fleet manager's perspective from the system. And we do also give fleet managers the ability to look 12 months back historically. So again, as mentioned previously, that then takes into consideration some of the more seasonal elements of the role, and it will give them an insight onto how that transition looks, taking into account the seasonality of the data that we provide.
Even with the right data, committing to a new model can be a risk. So if we're not sure how it will perform in the real world, as you mentioned, there's various factors that can influence that. So to Stuart, how can fleets use mid-term rental as a real world trial to see if a new vehicle actually works for their drivers before they sign a permanent contract?
Yeah, I mean, I love that word, real world trial, right? And really just echoing Amber's comments there around data is absolutely key at the moment. I mean, if you think about it, the automotive sector is probably going through the biggest transition since the introduction of the combustion engine. There's so much nervousness and uncertainty around transitioning to BEV or FEV as an interim, actually, and the data is allowing them to do that. Europe's car fleet has been 100% connected for several years now, so we're either sucking data directly from the OEM systems or a black box. And just to cite an example of that, actually, if you look at local authority, that all of which have decarbonisation programs leading towards 2030 or 2035, you're getting a lot of resistance from the end users, actually. Very few of them want to transition from an ICE vehicle, whether it be a van or a car, into a BEV, citing all sorts of reasons why they shouldn't. Now, there may be a desire at senior management level to transition, but they've got to put up with these and come back with reasonable arguments of why they should go into BEVs. What we did more recently, it was a local authority that moved a large proportion of their fleet to BEV vans, actually 60 or 70 BEV vans. We put the BEV vans in a particularly cold period in December. You may remember we did have a couple of weeks of cold weather. And you can almost envisage these drivers being sat on the driveways with their heaters fully on and trying to keep the cabs warm. Well, we got sort of anecdotal feedback from the drivers and forwarded to me saying these vehicles aren't fit for purpose, and actually we're having to constantly plug them in and charge. And so we pulled the data on the first batch that we sent in, and the reality was somewhat different to what they were saying. So on average, they were doing about 25 miles per day, but yet they were plugging in about 4 or 5 times a week, which really should have given them in excess of 1,000 miles a week. So you could see there was a relative amount of nervousness and resistance from the users to actually go to BEV, to transition. But that data soon put that to bed, actually, and that resistance and that noise subsided almost overnight. We could provide them with real-time data to say the vans are fit for purpose. You're only doing 25 miles per day. You don't need to plug in when your van's 80% charged. So yeah, I mean, echoing that does allow them to do that, and that flexibility around short-term flexible rental allows these sort of public sectors and large businesses to try, and that data allows them and enables them to make some sort of future decisions in terms of where their fleets are going over the next 4 or 5 years.
So if we're taking on these new vehicles, we have to ensure that the depot is ready to support them. So Naomi, how can a modular approach to charging stop electrification plans from being stalled by grid delays or by depot capacity constraints?
That's key, actually, because I think a lot of companies tend to wait. They put it on hold. They'll either wait and get the vehicles first and then think about the infrastructure, and that's not quite there. Or they think we'll just keep pushing it down the line and we'll almost wait for perfection before we start doing anything. And it's really key to think about starting and not waiting for perfection. And there's a number of different things that you can do. So you can start small and you can scale, and you can look at doing it in phases. So you can prioritize locations, you can prioritize vehicles that are almost what we call your low-hanging fruit, you know, your quick wins and ones that are relatively easy to electrify. There is some really great tech out there. I mentioned before around the V2G stuff, but Stuart, where you're saying there about, you know, trialing these vehicles, you don't have to put the full infrastructure in and start digging everything up. There are things like mobile EV charging solutions that help, you know, to kind of build that business case and do those temporary depots or when you're, you know, maybe doing pilot schemes, those kind of things. If you are thinking about putting infrastructure in and you're thinking about, you know, what that's going to look like longer term, plan early, get the experts in, right, and start your planning process. So where I touched on previously around your EV strategy, start thinking about, if you're planning early, you know, what does your business actually need? What does that look like longer term? And start being on the front foot of D&O applications, for example. These can take much longer than people expect. You know, it isn't just applying and you'll get your capacity and off you run. You know, it can be a month process. So think about, you know, if you can get your planning applications in early and you can start to build out that strategy. And again, if you're doing it with, you know, experts that can support you, we often help with, you know, the whole process through DNOs or IDNOs. Sometimes that's a better way of doing it rather than the district network operator. Go down the independent district network operator route, because you may find there that you're actually getting much better value. So you'll get back, you know, asset values and things like that through that approach. So there are different ways that you can do it there. And in the meantime, I think don't use that as an excuse to not do anything. You can put infrastructure in. You can think about that dig once. So, you know, you can think about longer term. I might need, I don't know, 20 chargers here. I'm going to start with 5. But if you dig once and put in the infrastructure for those, you can just add the heads on as that capacity comes, which is a much better value way of doing it. And equally, you can also think about ramping down the infrastructure that you're putting in. So you can put the infrastructure in, but don't have it working at full capacity, have it working at a slightly lower capacity. So there's lots and lots of different ways that you can really think about it. And for me, it's always that, as I mentioned earlier, that holistic approach, bringing it all together and thinking that not one solution is going to fit all. Think about building in your alternative energy sources, thinking about, you know, utilising charging as a whole, not just thinking about the depot. Can you use home charging, for example, you know, and these other things. And again, an expert will come in like us and help support you through that whole process and hold your hand through it all.
Thanks, Naomi. We have had a couple of questions submitted from the audience that we'll deal with at the moment. The first one is to Amber. Can telematics be personalised when a vehicle has numerous drivers?
Yeah, so one solution that we offer, we do have driver identification systems. We've got one that is used with a driver ID fob, but we've got lots of businesses now where if they utilise sort of an RFID card system at their place of work anyway, that can be utilised to identify the driver by tapping onto a reader that's installed in the cab of the vehicle. So when you have driver identification, you can look at usage of the vehicle based on the driver rather than the vehicle itself. So all of the same data applies, it's just applicable to the driver. So you can really split that down to see what the shift pattern for a driver is, as well as the asset. And again, when I mentioned before about driver behaviour within the vehicle and how that can impact on both fuel costs, and as you transition to EV, as Stuart mentioned before, it's about how they get the max out of the battery charge that's in the vehicle. And again, the driving style will have an impact on that. You can look at that by driver instead of by vehicle. So yeah, there's absolutely absolutely ways and means that that can be done, and we do offer products that support that.
Thanks, Emma. There's a slightly related question about fleet environments where vehicles are shared or contractors are involved. How do operators verify whether the specific action, the journey, the charge, the asset used should have been permitted before it happened? And is that something that data-led solutions are addressing yet?
So at the moment, there would be no way for us to identify whether a trip was supposed to happen. All we do is we provide the data to the fleet managers, and not necessarily just the fleet managers. The fleet managers can then drill that down even further and make sure that department heads are looking at their specific vehicles. And it's really the people on that ground level that will have an understanding of what that vehicle's supposed to do. So the telematics data, it just empowers those people then to be able to use the accurate, unbiased data, like I mentioned at the start, to make sure that that is a true reflection of what they believe they should be seeing for that vehicle.
Thank you, Amber. I've got a question for Stuart. For a fleet manager who's never used flexible rental strategically, what does the first 90 days of that transition typically look like? And what usually convinces them that it was the right call?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, actually. So the first 90 days are absolutely critical. That's the reality. And if I walk you through a typical journey for me and my customers, I mean, first of all, we'd make sure that the vans that they're ordering are fit for purpose, understand what the usage is. I've got a case at the moment, it's a really interesting one, where they install, build and maintain onshore wind farms, and in some pretty remote places, actually. They've been tasked by their senior management team to decarbonise, but yet many of these vans actually are doing sort of several hundred miles per day. We've been working with them to make sure we've got the best van in terms of the range, but also looking at the equipment that we're installing to try and take some weight out of it. And actually, Naomi mentioned about solar panels. We're putting solar panels on the roof, which charges the equipment and the inverters and the power tools so that they're not draining the batteries on the vehicles. We're trying to transition some of the ply lining, which is quite heavy and weighty, to more plastic, more robust, lighter lining. So there's an awful lot that we're doing. I mean, part of it as well is the telematics and making sure they understand their usage. I do say that, you know, most modern fleet managers will understand their fleet and understand where a BEV will work. I mean, most modern fleets do have telematics on them, so they should really know the suitable vehicles and the usage where those vehicles sit. And I can't sit here today and say actually BEV is the panacea. It's the future for everything. And the reality is it's probably not. You know, it in most cases, or in a few cases where they're doing heavy mileage, a BEV vehicle isn't suitable, but it's a good, healthy mix of BEV and ICE. That is the reality. And as we transition some of these users, and again, I think Naomi mentioned, or Amber mentioned, about the best usage of the vehicle. So we're trying to do on-site training around getting the best use of that vehicle and the battery. And that may be regen braking. It may be preheating the vehicle before you start your journey while it's plugged in. It might be heat the driver's seat and not the cab. It might be the trends that, you know, that there is, you've got to adapt to get the best use out of these vehicles. You know, I do think actually many in the fleet sector are sort of delaying and procrastinating around that decision to go BEV, because technology is moving at such a pace. You know, residuals are up and down, and battery mileage is increasing by the year. You know, that I think they're waiting to see what happens before they make a commitment, and that means in many cases they're sweating their assets into year 4 and year 5. And that's really where we can help get those assets on, get some flexible rental, work with us in terms of the data, work with us in terms of the training, and try and make that transition journey a little easier for you. So, yeah.
Thanks, Stuart. I've got another question for Naomi. We hear a lot about grid delays and depot constraints holding back electrification. what's the most common misconception fleet managers have about what it actually takes to get a site charging ready?
So I think a lot of people think the grid has plenty of power and it's just there and we just need to access it, right? So it's just about bringing a cable onto the site and suddenly we've got that. And unfortunately, the reality is that, yes, there is capacity, but that capacity is normally fully allocated already on paper. So there is a process. And when we apply for an upgrade to sites, there is often quite a large queue. So thinking about the timeline, the queue is there really because there's a number of different reinforcement works that have to come into play. Thinking about substations, transformer upgrades, it's all of those things that have to support the network in bringing the power to site. So it's quite a long process. It's not a quick, yeah, we'll just plug in a cable and suddenly we've got the power we need and it's all good. And also, I think it depends on the area that you're in. I talked earlier about, lots of things are electrifying, heat pumps, vehicles, industrial electrification. So in terms of that available capacity, it may not be available in some areas more than it is in others. So it depends as well where you're located and what power is actually there in the first instance. So I think this is one of the misconceptions I think people just think about in terms of those upgrades. And I think there are ways that, again, companies like us can help support our customers by having an understanding, working closely with DNOs, IDNOs, really understanding the process, getting the application right from the first day, rather than, having to be 3 months down the line and having to resubmit information. So yeah, it's unfortunately a process that we have to go through. There is a bit of red tape, and we are looking at trying to support with government to see how we can alleviate some of that red tape. But essentially, it's a process we have to move through.
Thanks, Naomi. I've got one quick one for Amber before we wrap up. What's the single most surprising thing that fleet managers discover when they first get proper visibility of their telematics data?
I think, as Stuart mentioned before, you are hard pushed to find a business now that's not had some form of telematics, but we see it a lot when people transition over to us. If they've not had reliable telematics data or they haven't had it at all, I think initially the biggest surprise for them is actually understanding and getting a grip on what those vehicles and the drivers are doing within those vehicles. I mean, we've had instances where we've been able to show fleet managers that people are parked up, supposed to be outside of the vehicle is just a mode of transport to get to site, and they've actually been sat with the ignition running inside that vehicle for a number of the work hours within the working day, instead of actually being on site and doing that job. So I think it's just giving them the ability to understand what's going on. And again, looping back to that point that the telematics data really is unbiased. We will only show you what's actually physically happening within those vehicles. And again, that links back to the point Stuart made about getting the most out of the vehicle. So if you've got people that are sat in the vehicles using the heaters and things like that, again, that will skew how they're able to transition, like Stuart mentioned before, when he was seeing issues with them saying that they were needing to charge the vehicle more times than they should have. So there's that. It's also things like people opting in for personal and business use is a big thing that we see at the moment, and being able to show fleet managers when the vehicle's being utilised outside of the core working hours it's supposed to be used. So again, giving them an idea of people that potentially are utilising that asset that haven't agreed to utilising that asset. And again, that shows an increase in mileage on the vehicle and things like that, which is all to be considered if you are going to move and transition over to EV.
Thanks, Amber. We just, to finish off, I'll go to each of you with a 30-second strategic takeaway for what the most important step a fleet manager should be taking now. So we'll kick off with Stuart. What action should a fleet manager take now that will deliver something immediate?
I would say, Simon, try EVs now. No time like the present, actually. We've tried to remove all the challenges and obstacles around trialing EVs, even as much as rate parity. So we're subsidising the rentals by saying you'll pay the same for a BEV Corsa as you will for an ICE Corsa or van, actually. So if you look at the challenges in a recent survey, customers said it was cost, it was infrastructure, and it was range anxiety. I don't think those things exist anymore. The reality is the charging infrastructure is improving at a rapid rate, with public charge points increasing, I think, by 40,000 last year alone. Price parity takes away on flex rental, takes away that cost implication. And then range anxiety, we're proven through data-led information that these vehicles are fit for purpose. So, really in the current environment, no time like the present to transition to BEV. And if you're worried about it, try Flexi and see if it does work. It's a partnership. We're in this together, actually.
Thanks, Stuart. And Naomi, 30 seconds or so on a strategic takeaway for fleet managers in terms of the grid and accessing electricity.
Yeah, so for me, just echoing really what Stuart said, just start. Don't let it hold you back. I think now is a great time for doing it. I think there are lots of professionals and companies and people out there that can really support you and advise you and help you make the right decisions. So use us, call on us, get us involved, and just start the process.
Thanks, Naomi. And Amber, what do you think fleet should be doing immediately that can help them on the road?
So I think initially use the data that's available to you, so you have it. And there's lots of fleet managers out there that probably aren't utilising the data, so we can give you that data, but it's up to you to do something with that data. So identify the assets that you can transition, identify what you need to transition, and then again, just reverting back to what Stuart and what Naomi have said, it's then thinking about how you implement that strategy long term in terms of the network, and then also how you look at maybe trialing that in terms of a short-term lease.
Thanks very much, Amber. We'll wrap up now. Thank you very much to our three speakers: Stuart Russell from Europcar, Naomi Nye from Drax, and Emma Shanahan from Quartix. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thanks very much for your time. We hope you found it insightful, and we'll see you again next time. Thank you.